In April of 1981, in a small mountain community in Northern California, a 14-year-old girl walked home to change clothes for church. What she found inside her family's cabin would become one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in American history. Decades later, investigators, journalists, true crime researchers, and true crime YouTube channels are still trying to piece together exactly what happened that night and why it happened at all. This is the story of Cabin 28, a case that has never truly been closed and probably never will be. Keddie was a tiny, remote resort community tucked into the mountains of Plumas County, made up of a scattering of small cabins surrounded by dense pine forest. It was quiet, close-knit, and the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name and children roamed freely between cabins without a second thought. Families came for the fresh mountain air and the sense of safety that came with living somewhere so far removed from the outside world. There was no reason for anyone in Keddie to lock their doors at night, which made what happened there feel even more unthinkable to those who lived nearby, and even more difficult for investigators to explain in the years that followed. The Sharp family had only lived there since the previous November. Sue Sharp, 36 years old, had recently separated from her husband and moved from Connecticut with her 5 children, settling into Cabin 28 partly because her brother lived nearby and could offer some support during the transition. Starting over in a new state with 5 kids was not easy, but by all accounts, Sue was determined to build a stable, quiet life for her family in Keddie, far away from whatever difficulties had pushed her to leave Connecticut in the first place. By April of 1981, the family had settled into a rhythm there. Sue's children, 15-year-old John, 14-year-old Sheila, 12-year-old Tina, 10-year-old Rick, and 5-year-old Greg, had made friends among the other kids in the resort, including a neighbor boy named Justin Smart, who spent a great deal of time with the family. The children had adjusted to the small community quickly, spending their afternoons outside together, the way kids do in a place with more forest than traffic. And by all appearances, life in Keddie had started to feel normal again. On the night of April 11th, the family's evening unfolded like any other. Sheila went to a friend's cabin next door for a sleepover, something she had done many times before without any concern. Tina spent part of the evening watching television with neighbors before returning home around 10 o'clock, walking the short distance back to Cabin 28 alone in the dark, as she often did in a community where nothing bad had ever happened. Sue stayed in Cabin 28 with her 2 youngest sons and Justin Smart, who was allowed to spend the night, as he sometimes did. Nothing about the evening seemed unusual to anyone in the neighboring cabins, and no one reported hearing or seeing anything out of place before nightfall. Meanwhile, John had spent the day in the nearby town of Quincy with his 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate. The 2 teenagers hitchhiked back to Keddie later that night, last seen walking along the highway before returning home sometime between 10 and 1 in the morning. It was an ordinary night for 2 teenage boys catching a ride home, and neither of them could have known that late-night walkback would be among the last things anyone would ever see them do. What happened after they walked through that door remains unknown to this day. Sometime that night, Sue Sharp, her son John, and his friend Dana were all violently killed inside the cabin, bound with medical and electrical tape, and either stabbed, strangled, or bludgeoned in an attack that investigators would later describe as frenzied and personal. The living room, once the center of a family rebuilding its life, became the scene of one of the most brutal unsolved crimes in the state's history, and the level of violence involved suggested to investigators that whoever did this had intense personal rage toward at least one of the victims, rather than this being a random or opportunistic act. In the next room, separated only by a thin wall, Sue's two youngest sons, Rick and Greg, along with their friend Justin Smart, remained completely unharmed. Whatever happened that night happened close enough for them to potentially hear it. Yet all three survived without a scratch, sleeping through one of the most violent nights their small community would ever know. This detail alone has puzzled investigators and true crime researchers for more than 4 decades, since it raises the uncomfortable question of whether the killer or killers deliberately chose to spare the children, and if so, why. The next morning, Sheila Sharp walked home to grab a change of clothes before church, expecting an entirely ordinary Sunday morning. Instead, she opened the door to find her mother, her brother, and his friend lying dead on the living room floor, in a scene so violent that she immediately understood something unthinkable had happened. She ran back to the neighbor's cabin in a panic, and the horror of Keddie became public within minutes as word spread through the small, tightly knit community, shattering whatever sense of safety its residents had once felt. As investigators processed the scene, they made another chilling discovery. Sue's 12-year-old daughter, Tina, was missing entirely. She wasn't among the victims inside the cabin, and she wasn't anywhere on the property. She had simply vanished, and no one, not the surviving children, not the neighbors, not the earliest investigators on scene, could explain where she had gone or whether she had left the cabin willingly or been taken from it by force. A hammer and knife were recovered from the scene, believed to be among the weapons used in the attack. But beyond that physical evidence, investigators had shockingly little to go on, and the case would soon be criticized as one of the most poorly handled investigations in California history. Reports later emerged of evidence being lost, mishandled, or never properly logged at all, compounding the difficulty of ever identifying who was responsible. For 3 years, Tina's fate remained a complete mystery. Her family held on to hope she might still be alive somewhere, clinging to any possibility that she had run away or been taken in by someone and would eventually be found safe and unharmed. Search efforts continued on and off, but with no solid leads, the case slowly grew cold in the public eye, even as it remained an open wound for everyone who had known the Sharp family. Then, in April of 1984, 3 years after the murders, a bottle collector searching the woods in a neighboring county stumbled upon a human skull half buried beneath fallen leaves. Forensic examination confirmed what everyone feared most. The remains belonged to Tina Sharp, found nearly 30 miles from Keddie, alongside a child's blanket, a jacket, and a pair of jeans that matched what she had been wearing the night she disappeared. The quadruple murder was finally complete, but the mystery had only deepened, since investigators now had to explain not just who committed the murders inside the cabin, but why Tina alone had been taken from the scene and left so far away in the wilderness. Shortly after the discovery of her remains, an anonymous caller phoned investigators asking if they had considered the Keddie murders in connection with the bones found in the neighboring county. The call contained specific details that only someone connected to the case could possibly have known, yet astonishingly, it was never properly followed up at the time, and the recording of that call sat forgotten in an evidence box for decades before investigators rediscovered its significance many years later. Over the years, 2 men emerged as primary suspects in the case: a neighbor named Martin Smart and his friend John Bubaid. Smart had reported a missing hammer around the time of the murders, one that would later be recovered from a nearby pond in 2016, more than 3 decades after the crime, reigniting public interest in a case many had assumed would never be solved. Both men have since passed away without ever being formally charged. Justin Smart, the boy who survived the night in the next room, gave investigators conflicting accounts over the years, at times saying he witnessed the killings firsthand, and at other times insisting he had only dreamed it, unsure himself of what was memory and what was nightmare. His descriptions helped create composite sketches of possible suspects, which were circulated publicly for years, but neither sketch ever led to a confirmed identification, leaving investigators with more questions than answers about what he actually saw or thought he saw that night. In more recent years, investigators have used modern DNA testing on evidence recovered from the original crime scene, including tape used to bind the victims, and have said publicly that it matches a living suspect. Yet even with that development, no arrests have ever been made, and the case remains formally unsolved to this day, frustrating both the victims' surviving family members and the generation of investigators who have inherited the case file with the hope of finally closing it. More than 4 decades later, the question that haunts this case isn't just who did it, but why the youngest children in that cabin were spared while everyone else was killed, and why Tina alone was taken from the scene rather than left behind with the others. Theories have circulated for years, ranging from a personal vendetta against the family, to a drug-related dispute, to a random act of violence that spiraled far out of control, but none have ever been definitively proven in a court of law. If you have a theory of your own about what really happened at Cabin 28, let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more deep dives into history's most disturbing unsolved mysteries.